In terms of governance, they say that this term, good governance, was first initiated by the World Bank in 1989, so the story goes, that they were the guys who kind of coined it. Not very sure, but reportedly that's the story. But it was something that was restricted to government and of course to corporates. NGOs never really thought in terms of good governance. Today the pressure of good governance is enormous on the NGO sector. Donors want it, companies want it, all stakeholders want good governance. Today, I think there was a time 30 years ago when people joined boards because their friends invited them to be on the board. You know, I've set up this organization and, you know, we've been in college together. Would you like to join my journey? And say, okay, he's my friend. How do I say no? He wouldn't know a thing. But, you know, my friend invited me, so I joined the board. That's the story of many NGOs. But today, board members have become demanding and they have become discerning, both. They want to know, why should we be on your board? What am I supposed to do? What is my job role? You want me to be a fundraiser there? That's not my job. I'm there because, you know, are you there for lending your name? Are you there for adding value to the organization? Well, all that and more, this panel is going to talk about. Over to you, Mayor.
Okay. So just very briefly, in the year gone by, I think CAP has done a lot of work in board governance in the last 1 year. And it just made me realize that a lot of NGOs today are giving a lot more importance to it. They're not only looking at the legal aspects of board governance, which was the case earlier. They are getting into even the softer side of providing their boards with proper roles and responsibilities beyond fundraising, as Naushir said, and other board-related functions. More and more NGOs are giving to board engagement and evolution. They want their boards to be dynamic. We've helped lots of NGOs form their governance policies, something that many NGOs didn't do earlier. In the last year, we've done quite a few of those. And we've also done a lot of training sessions for the boards, the entire board. So till now, CAP was doing a lot of training sessions on board governance, but the CEOs also came along. It was a session like this. But we've actually been to organizations, sat with their boards. I think one of them is also in the room here, Eliza. We've done, you know, 2 or 3, a series of sessions with them. And the boards are really looking at how they can change and be more contributive. So really that scene is changing, it's evolving. And now I'll hand it over to Rati.
Mayor and Naushir for setting the context, and welcome back after tea. I won't spend a lot of time on introducing my panelists because that's very well articulated in the handbook. But I would just like to say I'm really delighted and very thankful to have these 3 august gentlemen on the panel with me. In fact, one of them should be here and not me. And as you probably have seen from the booklet, collectively they have vast experience both in the social as well as in the corporate sector. They've been board members of various entities and have much practical knowledge to share with us all. So just to add a little bit to the context for this panel, so we all know the definition of governance broadly being sort of a method or something for an organization or a company to kind of govern itself or police itself, having systems, protocols, policies, and processes in place, some of which are mandated and compulsory to adhere to, and others which need to be internally crafted and designed just to help with the flow, the smooth functioning and effective functioning of an organization. And also includes the continuous monitoring as well as the proper implementation of systems, keeping them up to date, keeping them relevant, and understanding what are changing mandates that come from time to time. One important point I will conclude with, and that is, we could have really entitled this session Governance, but what we've what we would like to particularly focus on is really the title, which says Grow with Governance. So when you have good governance practices in your organization, how can it actually support the development and growth of the organization? Conversely, we have many examples, especially in the corporate world, which we continually read about, how a lack of governance has led to the collapse or the downfall of a company. So what we'd like to stress, and what Naushir has stressed and Swati stressed in the earlier session, is that governance isn't just a nice thing to do or a tick box kind of an activity, but really how can good governance practices, when embedded in an organization, lead to positives, prosperity, growth, development, when practiced in spirit really, and not just because it's mandated. So before I hand over to our panelists, I would like just a few ground rules. We would like your responses in about 3 minutes at a max. And then one more thing is that the whole area of governance is really a broad one. So when Mayor and all of us were brainstorming on questions that we could pose to the panelists, we really sort of zeroed in on 3 that we thought would be the most interesting, relevant, and provocative for the audience. But having said that, we're going to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for your questions. So please keep writing down any questions that you feel are relevant to this session and which you'd like to pose to these 3 gentlemen. So I'm going to start with the first one, which we thought was a really relevant one, and that is, what is the role of the board in embedding good governance practices into an organization? And maybe, Chitranjan, you can opine on that to start with.
Thank you, Rati. I think talking about the functions of a board in an NGO context is an important way of thinking about how an NGO works, actually. I think Naushir talked about the fact that the whole question of governance came into focus several years, 30 years ago now. Traditionally, the entire governance narratives and the literature has come from, again, as Naushir talked about, from the government and the corporate sector. And the fundamental reason for that has always been that the owners of those entities, whether it's people in the case of government or shareholders in the case of corporates, are different from those who manage those entities, whether it's the management or the politicians or whoever, the executive and so on and so forth. There has always therefore been felt the need for creating what we call a fiduciary system, a code of conduct which ensures that these people who are operating as agents for the owners, whether it's the management or the politicians in the case of government, they actually act as trustees of that power that has been given to them. And therefore there's an elaborate set of rules and so on and so forth, which may or may not be followed in practice, but they're there. And certainly for corporates, there are very good elaborate rules of governance. In the case of NGOs, I think it needs to be seen somewhat differently. The reason for that is that most often, in the case of I think 99% of the NGOs, the owner or the founder or whatever and the manager are not different. They are sitting there, they're all engaged with the processes, and therefore the questions of trustee responsibilities does not arise. He is the fellow who's set it up, he is the fellow who's putting himself out there, and therefore... So the question of what governance ought to do for such organizations needs to be looked at slightly differently, it seems to me. And I think what needs to happen, and Rati alluded to it, this is what I feel, is the boards need to have the ability to help the organization go to the next stage. We're not talking now of compliance. We're not now talking about meeting laws. That's a given. If you break laws, you go to jail or you pay a fine or you get shut down or whatever. And therefore, that is not a matter of discussion. You have income tax laws, you have contribution laws, you have all sorts of laws, which there is no choice about following them. So all you have to do is to make sure that you have systems that do track the laws and you follow them. But there's much more beyond that. What is possible for external resources who are the board members to do in order to fill the gaps that the organization needs to be filled? The organization, a typical NGO, has lots of responsibilities to society. It has set itself up as an organization which will help fill those gaps that have not been filled in the forward march of the society. It has set itself as an organization that will seek to ameliorate oppression that has not been otherwise ameliorated. It has set itself up in creating capacities in public services that have not otherwise been made available, etc. Those are large, very big undertakings. They require lots of skills, they require lots of application, they require lots of thinking and strategizing. They're not small undertakings. And I feel that the primary contribution, and in that sense, the role of a board, would be how do we help this organization fill the gaps that it has in order to go forward along the path that it has chosen for itself.
So with your vast corporate experience, Pradeep, may I ask you to really comment on that and also to opine that do you agree with Chitranjan, and is that the primary role of the board, and what more or what less, or what is the board the role of the board in your opinion?
Thank you, Rati. I'll try and build on what you started by saying, can you grow with governance? And to your point, whether compliance is taken for granted, I'll pick up these 2 points. I come from a corporate sector, like an NGO. I'm a non-NCO, non-contributing organization from the social sense. So the point I want to bring is, and this is one of the jobs of the boards in the corporate is to make them contribute in a social and society and environment. You know, in manufacturing and thing, we grew up with a belief, and I've been in manufacturing, hey, do you want quality or do you want quantity? I can't give you both. If you want quality, I won't give you quantity. That was a belief in which manufacturing sector, till we came to a point, no, you can have quality and quantity. Then came this whole thing, either you want ethics or you want performance. Please don't ask me both. You want results now? I'll give you results. Don't talk about ethics. There was built in, and then you said, no, we can grow. And the latest which has come, which we talk about, is this, hey, do you want development or you want environment? Buddy, please, vikas hai to vinash hoga. The type of a belief that you can't have both. So this either the tyranny of the or is what you touched upon when you says, can you still grow with governance? The issue is not only corporates, not only NGOs, not only anybody needs to keep this point that there is nothing like a laissez-faire in terms of your values and ethics and so on. If you want to grow, you have to grow with governance. And that's the thing which today, to a large extent, and I'll just come to your point, to a large extent, that's a challenge of the corporates. Because we, in private sector, how many of you are from corporates here? Very few. So, since I come from one, I can beat myself up. Like I always make fun of these MBAs from IIM, the bud types, because of being one myself. So there is this whole thing one you can do. I think these corporates have often believed, and Amit, I'm going to be extra harsh just to bring home the point. We believe we're doing a big ehsan to the society by generating economic wealth. We are God's gift. Give us free land to play and, make it easy for us. And all that is fine. We have to make it easy of doing business, make in India. Modi sahab naraz ho jayenge if I don't say that. But the point, while you're doing all this, there is a certain code of conduct, there is a certain code of ethics that you need to follow, because that's the word responsible, socially responsible business. And the point I'm coming to what is the role of the board? It's not sure that compliance is taken for granted, at least in corporate world. A whole lot of us in corporate world do a tick mark. Somehow, MPCB man has come, so I have to do something, or is a labor inspector has come, I have to do something. We do in text, that also if we find ways. So even compliance is a challenge in corporate world, and I hope NGO is saner, is more socially conscious about it, and there are much lesser compliance issues as far as thing. But yes, I think compliance is a must. It is like a necessary condition for you to get on to the next, and socially responsible enterprise, and I'm not talking about social business, socially responsible NGO, socially responsible government, socially responsible hospital, socially responsible educational institution, all that needs a certain amount of governance. The role of board, since I don't have enough experience, or I have touched many NGOs, I've touched the social space, I've been in corporate, carry a visiting card of a corporate, but I've been very, very heavily involved into social agenda. And I would want to bring out the point that the role of a board, at least in corporates today, while the board is supposed to give the direction, strategic, all these nice fancy words that MBAs use, all the direction that we want to take the organization into. Having said all that, there is what you do is what the boards decide. How you do somehow is not supposed to be board's business. I know what to do, whether I'm an owner representative or a multinational representative. Multinational is another set of owners. I mean, what are they? They give you the direction and so on. So generally it was perceived, board strategy, we can do. And this company law this time, it doesn't apply to the social sector, is been a watershed. It just brings in the element of governance so totally. The whole focus with respect to all elements of governance, what is this governance responsible for? And I think the point that you brought out, in NGO, the promoter is also the karta. And he's the main thing. In corporates, it's not necessarily the case. The owner's representative, owner, a multinational representative. There is the whole lot of people who are not in the boardroom. The employees are not in the boardroom, the customer is not in the boardroom, the supplier is not in the boardroom, the society is not in the boardroom, the environment is not in the boardroom, Sarkar is not in the boardroom. So the governance role in a board, role of board in governance is to ensure that all the, typically said minority shareholder is a very loose way in which in corporates we define role of independent directors. I'm an independent director on many companies. I've been a managing director of companies for 25 years. So I've seen it both as an owner's representative. The last one I want to bring in, the role of the board is to show the mirror as far as governance is concerned. Not only show the mirror, I mean, if the face is not looking good, ensure that it looks good. Just showing the mirror you're looking ugly doesn't help. You just need to get onto this. I think the board has a significant responsibility in ensuring the governance part. The business direction, frankly, whether it's a multinational or the SETG, at least in corporate worlds, they decide the direction most of the time. Others just vet it and give their input. So I would say huge, huge role of the board in ensuring governance. Thank you, Rati.
Thanks, Pradeep, for your views. Before I hand over to Amit, I'd really like, I guess you've seen in the profile that Amit is on the board of not only corporates, but also a foundation. So he's going to sort of talk to us from both the sides and both perspectives. And Amit, would love to hear from you.
Thanks. I think both Pradeep and Chitranjan have made some great points. I'll just make three, and some of them may overlap, so my apologies for that. I think the first point is, every Jan 1st, I write myself a diet and exercise plan. And every December 31st, I realize I need to write a new one the next day. And that's relevant in my mind because a lot of governance lands up being in theory and not in execution. I think what's really important is to bring a massive execution emphasis to governance and to focus a little bit less, in my mind, often on the theory of it. We get overly focused on the theory of it. I think the execution of it is actually a lot of simple common sense and a lot of the points that both Pradeep and Chitranjan have carried. I think the two things, as I look at it from a commonsensical perspective, that boards need to be focused on, first of all, is just in being conscience keepers. And what I mean by that is, we have a responsibility that organizations that we sit on boards of are adhering to rules. Anyone who's down in the trenches will always have the tendency to break a rule to get something done today because there's, a challenge that you face on a daily basis. And I think it's important for the board to make sure that those rules aren't being broken, whether it is responsibility to donors, responsibility to compliance with, from a government perspective, any other stakeholder, employees, etc. So I think that's a big element in my mind of board responsibility, which is making sure that the organization has systems that are working, has policies that are in place and that are working to ensure that the conscience of the organization is absolutely intact. The second point in my mind is a mentoring kind of a role. And I think this is where it's a little different in my mind. I sit now on more boards of not-for-profits than for-profits. It was the reverse, 5 years ago. I think the role in not-for-profits needs to be a little bit more nurturing as opposed to in for-profits where, often as Pradeep pointed out, it's very clear what the direction is and good support systems exist. But I think in case of NGOs, it's very important to, for the board members to be thought partners with the senior, executives in the organizations. Make sure that they map themselves to the 3, 4, 5 people who really provide leadership, to the organization. Or if it's a small organization, just the one, leader out there. But, be a person who can challenge that person's thinking, who can, understand, who clearly has a way to get that person up from this level to that level so that the organization can really move forward. So I think there's a big, mentoring aspect that in my mind, kicks in. I think there's, also a sustainability aspect that kicks in. Most organizations on the not-for-profit side, unfortunately, are destined to collapse with as and when the leader who started them exit. And that's because there isn't necessarily an emphasis on sustainability the way the for-profit world has by and large, figured out a way how to be sustainable. And because, businesses can be sold at the end of the owner's life, they effectively, transition to new owners. That doesn't really happen in the not-for-profit space. So really, I think the second element is making sure that there's an emphasis of sustainability. I think the third is challenging people. I think there is also a tendency in the not-for-profit space that often that because you're actually doing social good, that that itself is a reward. I think the role of the board needs to change in really challenging people to rise to their full potential and really understand that just like there's a unit of measurement in the corporate world, which is profit or market cap, depending if your company is listed, that you need to continuously be on this journey and you need to think and problem solve for how to get from A point to B point, and B point being, the vision that you often put up in your balance sheet or on the walls of your office, but you always land up forgetting. So I think that those two things in my mind are really the most critical things for the board to focus on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, that really takes me nicely into the next question that I thought of, because I often wear both these hats as well. So how engaged really should a board be? Sometimes we find that, are they too involved? Are they interfering in areas where they should not be interfering? Are they really playing just the role of mentoring, nurturing, or are they kind of putting their fingers into issues which really should be left to the people in operations of the organization? So I'm going to ask Amit that first, please, and then we'll go around the...
Yeah, no, I think it's always a fine line, and I think people are always discovering what which side of the line you are in, and therefore how you need to correct. By the way, it's no different in the corporate world, in my experience. I mean, you'll find interfering boards in the corporate world, but you'll often find passive boards. I've seen a lot of really highly respected companies in India, companies that, you'll see on top governance lists, which have horrible board dynamics. Passive boards, the promoters will typically select, guys who'll come and, effectively what I call be kadoos in meeting. They'll just sit and nod and not really challenge. And I've seen actually very vibrant not-for-profit boards. I mean, Akanksha is a great one where we laugh, often cry because we challenge each other so much. So I think, when you really step back, I think you find both in corporate world and not-for-profit space, you find people need to continuously evaluate. And I think it's very contextual. It also depends on what the need of the organization is and what the nature of the leader is. I mean, some leaders thrive if they are supported actively. Some leaders thrive if they are supported a little bit more passively. They need more elbow room. So I think there is a contextual element. It often comes from the type of the leader you are working with, but it also comes from where the organization is at a point of time. Some organizations are broken. When an organization is broken, the board needs to roll up its hands much more and be much more involved. And some organizations are what you would call on autopilot. And the board needs to play a different kind of a role, and the intensity needs to be different. So I don't think there is a one cap fits all answer. It depends on the context. And I think the board needs to be thoughtful of the point that you made at all point of times, thinking whether it's on the right side of that line or the left side of the line.
Thank you. So, Chitranjan, as the leader of an organization, a leader of a large NGO, would you like to opine on what Amit just said?
Yeah, I think the thing that I completely resonate with is that this is a very, very contextual question. And the way I see the role of a board, I think it's true that it's contextual, and yet I would propose a framework which seems, in my opinion, to apply to everyone. And it's a framework that we use for our work in the areas that we do. We work with governments and so on and so forth. And we've said our task in those places, is capacity building for building capacity. We're saying we're not going to go out and build and train teachers. We're going to try and build the capacity of that system to train teachers. Because that is the more sustainable, that is the longer term work, that is what builds that organization into a learning organization. And I think in some sense, I would use the same framework for a board. Board's responsibility ought to be to build capacity for building capacity out there, right? And so that will be contextual. It will depend on what the organization is doing. Is there adequate capacity already within the organization to deal with those challenges? What can the board bring in addition beyond what is already existing? Sometimes, as Amit is saying, there may not be much that is needed because the capacities already exist. At other times, there will be stuff that will be needed, and that is when the board needs to roll up its sleeves and bring those capacities to bear. So broadly, I would say that. I would say it is contextual, but there's probably a frame that can be put around it, which can help the board to understand what is required of it at a given point in time.
Thanks. Actually, I'd love, Pradeep, if given your vast corporate experience, can you actually give a sort of a practical example where you've found that a board has indeed, or some board members have indeed been able to build capacity for capacity building of the organization? And I'm just throwing this at you now. But just in case you have an example which would be, which then the audience could relate to on this.
Yeah, I certainly will give an illustration, but let me just bring the corporate flavor here. Under the new laws, even though the context, and I agree with both these gentlemen about the context setting, the life of the organization, what situation it is in, the profile of the promoter, owner, determines the extent to which the board gets involved. But today, under the new law, I don't think board people, certainly independent directors, have a choice. They have to get under the skin. The promoters don't like it, perhaps, but they do it. Today, the responsibility of the audit committee, and Amit will confirm this, in fact, is something more than the CFO sometimes, related party transactions, etc. Some of the new legislations which have come in and certain responsibility that comes, sometimes I'm an independent director of many companies, I keep wondering, I tell my auditors very jocularly, Arey Sala, I come once in 3 months for a 3-hour meeting and you make me sign all sorts of documents, and auditor himself puts disclosure, these based on the basis of what has been given stuff. Stuff like this. So auditors will get under the skin at some point. They should. I'm sorry, the independent directors will get into it, and that's their job, and I think it's important. However, that's with respect to governance, compliance issues. And I'll just come to the illustration. The other role where I think the directors can play a role is certainly you have somebody who's like Arjun, looking at only the eye, the management, the NGO promoter, I'm using management in a philosophical sense or the thing, who have a very, very precise perspective of what they want to achieve. Now, there are some issues which perhaps they need to be made aware of, and it's the duty of the board to make that context come. Now, to an illustration that you talked about, I'm on the board and I can talk about the company called Persistent, which is an IT company. People know about it, and a lot of people ask me, what am I doing? Because I'm actually IT challenged personally, but I'm there. The point that comes in is here's a situation where the board does get into engagement into situations which sometimes we don't even understand, but we ask the questions. Sometimes you can be smart by asking the dumb questions. And we go on to the further of each of us as directors is mentoring one business leader of that non-board members. I mean, somebody is operational leader, delivery leader, each one of us. Now, is that the responsibility of the board director? No. But is that's what capacity building for capacity. You know, you are creating your knowledge to somebody besides the minutes that get recorded by the company secretary, there is a role. So I think boards can, if they take their job seriously, in that role of adding capacity. And there are instances where the promoter or let's say I'm using the word promoter, a multinational is also promoter. It can be Siemens, it can be Cummins. So they also should look at the benefit that comes through. Now the last point that should they be like a monkey on your shoulder? Perhaps not. But the point is, if you don't have anybody on your shoulder, chances are you'll go astray sometime. So I think there's a role for the board to play a role.
I'll just conclude with an example, a practical example from my own experience, which just came to me as you were speaking, actually. I really think there is a role for, of course, collectively for the board to play, but also using individual competencies and skills of board members. And in a particular company where I'm a independent director, they're going through a phase of leadership development for their 30 top leaders. You know, they're taking them to the next level as the company is growing. And I'm part of a cross-functional committee with one external consultant, one me as the independent director, because I have a background in HR and OD. And actually, I have to say, I think I'm adding value. I hope I'm adding value. But it's also helping me to think about a lot for other organizations I work with. So I really think that one thing that I could just leave, conclude this question with is that it's really up to us in organizations also to utilize our board members to the best of their competence and abilities. Very often we just have them, as Pradeep and others said, coming in once in 3 months and then walking out. But really, can we understand within our organization what are their special skills and competencies, and then use them as sounding boards or to mentor particular people in our organizations as well? I think they could play a hugely valuable role. And that brings me to the third question that we put together to ask the board. And I think it's something that a lot of NGOs and foundations grapple with. And what we wanted to check was, do you as panelists believe that resource mobilization or fundraising is really a key role for the board? How involved should the board be in resource mobilization and fundraising? It's something that differs from each board that I have been on in foundations, and I'd love to hear views from all of you, that what do you see in terms of resource mobilization? And may I say also a little more broadly, the resource does not necessarily mean only money, but also human resource mobilization for an organization you're involved with. And Pradeep, you can start this time.
Let's make a distinction between the full-time executive directors on the board. I mean the promoter, the managing director, or the HR director in a corporate sense. And I'm sure there are full-time executive, full-time people who are working. Their job is to do resource mobilization. That's what they're there. So I'm not even getting into that role. That they have to do because that's what they're running an enterprise. The finance guy need to mobilize finance and technology. In case, again, forgive me, friends, I come from a corporate background, so when I'm using terminologies, but basically, it's a similar situation. All the inputs that are required to run an organization efficiently is resource. I would come to the external directors, independent or dependent, doesn't matter. What should be their role in resource mobilization is the point that we. Now, here there is a bit of a perception issue, contextual issue. A large organization may not be requiring money, but they may be desperately needing some good talent, or they may be looking for some opportunities and so on. I personally believe that an independent director or a non-executive director or a non-functioning member of the management of an organization who sits on the board certainly cannot pretend that I'm a stud, I'm a consultant, I'll tell you what to do and get out. I'm supposed to be only a director, I mean, I just tell you, I direct you. Sort of a role. I think if you are honestly going there as a role to be a part of the organization, part of its top leadership, obviously you should help. And I say this with a little guarded thing. In what? Identifying talent? Most definitely. I'm an outsider. I look at people all over. I have my engagement with the company or the NGO doesn't have an opportunity. Of course, if I find somebody with enlarged heart, you mean large-hearted people for NGO, and I find, why should I not recommend such a person? So talent identification, talent, helping them get it, and most important, as I said, mentoring people. I think resource mobilization also include making talent. So I think on people thing, most definitely. Then you come to the second thing, which respect to really opportunities. In business, we say there is a supplier, who could be your supplier? There is a channel partner, he can be your channel partner. I'm giving an advice. I'm not brokering, I'm not doing a Bhadji's role, but I'm just helping you identify people. Same thing can happen in NGO. Hey, you are in this space and this organization is looking, CSR focus is on that same space. Why don't you do this? And to me, opportunity identification is resource mobilization because you're identifying, and similarly that happens, most definitely. Funding becomes a bit of a issue because there are some who are capable of doing it, and if they can help the organization find donors, most definitely. The two things we need to be guarded of, that there is no conflict of interest, and I think this is certainly true in the corporate world. I'm sure it is true for the NGO world, that you are, not abusing is a strong word, but you're not misusing your position as a director to get into transaction. In corporate world, Amit, this happens all the time. I mean, somebody's an eminent lawyer, he's on your board, somebody's an eminent chartered accountant, he's on your board, and there's a legal issue. Should we give that assignment to such and such person, sort of a thing. There's a conflict of interest. So similarly here, as long as there is no conflict of interest, I think resource mobilization is fine. And the other one is at some point of time, I think which comes to the previous question about, you need to, you can put your arms around, but you still have to be at arm's length, you know the difference. You just need to be sure that you provide the space to the people and not just be over and engaging beyond a point that's required. So I think, yes, resource mobilization is the responsibility of a director.
Chitranjan, your views on this?
Yeah, I think if I were to take the earlier framework, if you like, the boards there ought to be there to help that organization achieve what it is set out to do. At certain points in time, if the executive lacks the capacities for certain areas, such as resource mobilization, such as people identification, such as opening doors and identifying opportunities, then the board has two, it seems to me, clear responsibilities. If it wants to be in that position. One is to help plug the immediate problem. I don't have money today. The head of the organization, the executive is not able to do it. Something has to happen here. But longer term, how do you build the capacities of the organization to do that in a longer term, right? So again, it's the same, the framework that I use is the same one, which is you look at what is needed out there, what are the opportunities, what are the responsibilities, what are the resource gaps, what are the capacity gaps, and the board has no choice but to fill them. It also works, it seems to me, in the other way, and you talked about how the organizations need, how the NGO executive need to look at the board, etc., in terms of bringing in the right people and getting them to participate in the way. It seems to me that it is important for the board to also evolve in ways that make it possible for the board to support the requirements that are necessary. A board that might have been appropriate 10 years ago in the context of a particular set of circumstances, opportunities, and capacities within the organization may no longer be appropriate today simply because they're not adding very much value at this time. And I think for both the board itself and for the executive to constantly be looking at that and seeing where are we, where do we need to move from here, how does the board need to change so that the key opportunities today can be addressed effectively, I think is an important part of the work.
Amit, yeah.
I'll make 3 points. I think one is that I like the framework Chittaranjan had put out in the beginning as well. I think the role of the board is to build capacity, including in my mind for fundraising within the organization. I think so. It's very important to make sure that you sit down and you think about how you're going to build that. I've seen, in many cases, my wife and I have been very focused on capacity building in general. And one of the things we do when we've got approached for grants increasingly in the last 5 years is fund the hiring of a fundraiser as opposed to actually write a check for the programs, because and we have seen this in 2 out of 3 cases, the cost of the fundraiser lands up getting paid for many times over by the end of the year, because they'll go out and bring in adequate amount of funds. So I think the boards need to be very focused on making sure that they're building that capacity within the organization to fundraise. Point number 1. Point number 2, I think, and this is where again the private sector is a little different from the corporate sector, mainly because the ecosystem for fundraising in the private sector is a very well-developed ecosystem. It's evolved over a 100-year period. Lots of intermediaries, cost of capital raising is low in the not-for-profit sector. That's all changing. The demands are increasing, but the supply isn't keeping pace. And so I think boards do have a more heightened role for supporting capital raising in the not-for-profit sector than they do in the for-profit sector. And I think, Rati, you made a very important point on skill mapping. I think everyone doesn't need to do it. All board members, you don't need to have all your board members contributing towards capital raising. Some can contribute in very different ways, with HR, with organization development, leadership development, etc. But I think it's helpful to have a couple of board members who can really help anchor the capital raising requirements of the organization. I mean, the fact is that some cases, and we are learning this, I'm sure a lot of the folks who've tried to experience raising money for CSR, the most often point of feedback I get is that it's very top-down. You need to basically know someone really senior in the organization, and then the fundraising person can kick in and get mapped to the person handling, the processing within the organization. But the process starts top-down. When a process starts top-down, to have the expectation that your folks within the organization will be able to go and just completely convince the CEO is, in my mind, a little misplaced. And so you need to have the top-down, conversation. I mean, like, for example, a bunch of us are building a university outside of Delhi right now. It's a 1,000 crore project. And it would be foolish for us to assume that executives will have the ability to go out and raise 1,000 crores, right? And so those of us who are doing it, I spend 2 days a month going out and fundraising, working with, corporate leaders and philanthropists, as does Ashish Dhawan and a few of us who've come together to build that, because, that's the only way we'll basically get there. So again, contextually, I think you need to think about how much capital you're raising, what kind of people you're going to raise it with, and then design your board accordingly to make sure some people have the responsibility of supporting the team to basically get there.
I think that was very valuable indeed. One thought that just went through my head as all 3 of them were speaking was the role that even people working in not-for-profits and foundations need to have to sort of better collaborate, work with, and empower your board. I think very often there's a kind of a bit of a disconnect. I don't know how many of you in the room are kind of like leaders of your organizations. And sometimes I think that there's a disconnect between, well, the leader is normally there at the board meetings, the quarterly board meetings, but how many others have a role to play in actually, in some way, talking to a board member, influencing his thought, etc. I just thought I'd leave that thought with you. As we conclude on the panel, as I said, because of paucity of time, we really looked at 3 questions, but I'd like each of my panelists to spend the last 2 or 3 minutes with 1 or 2 key takeaways that you'd like to leave the audience with. It could be a practical example, it could be your own experience, but something that we've not been able to touch upon. And I realized when I came onto the stage that I'm actually talking to CAP, C-A-P. with all the panelists here. So let me start with C, then I'll go to A. So Chitranjan.
Right, so... so if I were to say quickly what recommendations would I make to leaders of other organizations, etc. I think we talked about it briefly. I think it's very important for all of us to look at what are the key gaps that we experience in carrying out our mission. Where do we need help from outside, not only to make sure that we remain compliant with laws so that we don't get into trouble, etc., but in terms of where we are going to go. And then look for, I mean, all of us have networks. We can draw upon resources in terms of, you know, I want help here, I want help here. But the board is a very important, it's an integral part of the family in some sense. And it makes sense to empower the board to help us. And so I would say it makes sense for us to look constantly at how is our board composed, have an engagement with that board in terms of what we need from them and how we can support them, and also get the board involved in the whole process of the evolution of the board. How does this need to move? Where does it need to go? Who needs to move in? Who needs to move out? What do existing board members need to bring in terms of skills? What do they need to grow as? I mean, everyone talks about board members coming in and saying, let us help these people grow. But it might be worthwhile for the board, for us to help the board members to think how they might grow in their roles so that they can support the organization better.
Yeah, no, let me build actually on some of the points that Chitranjan raised. I think all of this begins with being very thoughtful about how you construct your board to start with, and then how you actually run the board itself. On construction of board, I think most, again, I'd say 9 out of 10 NGO leaders, and it's true, by the way, in the corporate world as well, people don't construct boards very thoughtfully. And I think the general pitfalls is you do not do proper skill mapping, first of all. So you need to think of the different areas that are useful for a company or an NGO's growth, and then make sure that you have all the right skills. You know, some people will have very different things to contribute than others, and you need to have the right mix of folks on your board. So I think being clear about that, you know, what will be helpful to you in your journey to realize that mission or vision that you've put out is very important. The second thing in my mind, which is very important once you're clear about the skills that you're looking for, is looking for engagement level. I think this is where people make the biggest mistake. Everyone goes for names that they think will add value to the perception of the NGO. I think it's far more important to go for people who will want to be engaged and who you'll be able to engage with. You'll otherwise find a lot of cases I've seen that people then tell me that there's a well-respected person on the name, and I recognize the name and I'll ask them, how has this person contributed to you? And I discover sometimes that they've not even showed up for meetings for 2 years. And yet people will target exactly that same person when they want to build their next board. And I think there are a handful of names that get requested because everyone thinks that, you know, they are really great personalities, and having them on the board will enhance the, you know, perception of the organization. In my mind, that's wrong. Invest in board members, i.e. catch them young, catch them when, you know, they're really keen to roll up their sleeves and do things for you, and let them grow with you as you grow as well. So I think that's, in my mind, the second thing. The third is you have to be thoughtful on how do you run your board as well. You know, how do you engage with them offline, you know, through between the two meetings that you, statutory meetings that you will have, you know, making sure that they have full context to, you know, the service that you're providing, by making sure that they go, they see it, experience it, talk to beneficiaries, talk to donors, etc. So I think all of that is very important, and the board meeting itself, to make sure that they are structured well and they are good, robust conversations, they are debates, they are not basically a checklist of compliance points that you're just trying to quickly cover and then get everybody out of there. So I think those 3 points in my mind is something which I've found, if people focus on, they can get a lot more out of their boards.
So you want me to put the final cap? Yes. Okay. So I would actually build on. So I was very impressed by your whole theme around capacity building, or board being capacity building. Beware, this ministry might put you into capital goods industry, because that's what they're supposed to do, board of directors into that. And I'm building on what Amit also said. Yeah, point number one, with respect to the board, role of the board, I think just the way in corporates, we tend to get more of the same and not get as much variety as the wholesomeness of the board requires. Don't fall under the trap that, get people, offbeat people on your board. Sometimes they give suggestions which comes in handy. As Amit said, don't chase the same icons everywhere. Get somebody who can give a different perspectives. We have benefited significantly in some of the corporates by getting one. Two, again, building on the same points, board should not be, board deliberation should not be, and 3 companies that I'm on the board of, when the meeting takes place, we have only, in a 1.5 days board meeting, only 2 hours is only board. Rest of the time is all the leadership who sits with the board. So board is not some select committee of the parliament. I don't know how they meet, but anyway, what is the, but it's and what they select. But the point is, should be some openness. The purpose is because A, the board benefits by the views of others, and secondly, the individuals get benefit by the thing. It's just not he comes in or she comes and helps the CEO. That's not the point of the board. Then he or she can have an advisor. So I think engagement is important. I really would suggest that what we did, at least my persistent experience, when you individual board members take ownership of 1 or 2 leaders, mentor them, meet them regularly, is a great way of developing the capacity, again, in the organization. That is important. And lastly, the point that I want to do is, we in corporates, we use the word professional and efficiency, God knows what all terminology we use. We believe we understand all this better. And we think NGOs are the ones who are really socially alive, alert, caring. And I think we need to bring this element in NGOs, and this is again a capacity building I've been personally engaged with IIM Ahmedabad also. Again, they're trying to do is to, how do we get into, how to make a proposal, how to get it. There's certain element in NGOs which can benefit from the corporate. There are not too many things you can learn, but some things you can learn from the corporates. So some of the things we can do. Similarly, the corporates can learn from the NGOs too. So I would suggest a two-way movement. Some of the corporate leaders should be on NGO boards, and some of the NGO leaders should be on corporate boards. Damn it, socially responsible business is important. And professionally runs NGO is also reality. We should push both. So I think there has got to be in the boards a movement of this, rather than corporates going only to BSE index companies, and somebody, I don't think, right, and NGOs going only for the NGO types. And I'm using the word in a very positive sense. We should have diversity. It'll help both. Thank you.
May I just add that while, as Pradeep was saying, there are, I was just going to say the lighter mode, saying why, as Pradeep was saying, there are things that NGOs might learn from the corporates and vice versa. There are things that we might want not to learn also.
Like not inviting them for a CAP session.
Okay, on that great note, I just want to say a big thank you to CAP. So, in more ways than one. And just before we conclude, we have some great questions here. So, in fact, they are very appropriately, 1 questions for Amit, 1 questions for Chitranjan, and 1 questions for Pradeep. And then 1 question is a general one. So, I think we have about 15 minutes, May? Okay, so Amit, I will start with yours. I hope I'm reading it right. So, why do board members hesitate in holding each other accountable to contribute meaningfully to the NGO that they are serving? That's a great question.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, actually. And it's interesting, this whole accountability movement for board members is also a recent movement in the corporate world as well. It's only now that in the West, You actually have board accountability surveys, which are mandatory. I sit on the board of a New York Stock Exchange listed company where we actually have to rate each other. And you have to rate the board, and board evaluation is a very critical part of, and you have to actually present that report, and activist shareholders can actually get hold of it as well. And I think, in the not-for-profit space, for somehow a lot of people think that it's a favor that they're on a board. They're doing to somebody. I don't understand quite why that's the case. I think it's a privilege. But a lot of people think it's a favor because there isn't a compensation element, or financial compensation element linked to it. And so they forget the fact that they actually have a responsibility. So my personal view is, and I've done this in the past, I won't name which boards, it's as important to be able to fire a board member as it is to be able to hire a board member. And you have to, it does cause problems because, relationships get soured, but I think you have to work towards making sure if you have a non-contributor board member, that you figure a way to basically, get them out of the board. It becomes an important sign to those who stay as well. I think it's important to also push the organization involved with to evaluate each other. That same framework that exists in the corporate sector now is coming to India as well. We are doing it for the first time. Pradeep will tell you, in lots of Indian, all the listed companies now, it's becoming common. People are still doing it with trepidation, I know a lot of people are afraid, and I get sometimes calls from people who are conducting the surveys to say, did you really mean that? But I think we will have to move towards a thing where we critically evaluate each other, because otherwise, we'll have largely defunct boards.
I'd like to just add to that. So Pradeep and I are on 2 Tata board companies, and I'm actually saying the name of the company because I really, and then I'm on the board of 2 others. Nowadays women are in high demand because of this mandate that you have to have a woman director. So suddenly we are all in demand. But just to say that I will not name the other companies, but I think, again, the board evaluation also needs to be done with a certain spirit of actually true evaluation. Not, again, just because it's a tick mark and because it's a mandate now as per the Companies Act. And I've seen this on other companies that it is certainly not done in that spirit. Whereas the boards that Pradeep and I are on, the one board that we are on together, I certainly find that there's a very robust evaluation system and process being put together by the Tata Group of companies. So again, that's really an important one.
May I make a comment?
Of course.
I think one of the reasons why board members don't hold each other accountable is mostly because the board isn't accountable. If you haven't got a specific set of outcomes set out for the board, if the board thinks that it's enough for it only to meet once in 3 months, and as long as they come, that's enough, and sometimes not even that, then obviously there is nothing to hold each other responsible for. And it's only when we move to the point in all, and there are lots of NGOs which have that kind of a system, so I'm not suggesting it's true for everyone. But wherever it is the case that the board is simply, as Amit was saying, doing you a favor by showing up, there's no reason to evaluate each other or anyone on the board.
So keep the mic with you, Chitranjan, because the next question really very nicely weaves into what you just said, and it's for you. Some trustees seem to be for life and difficult to change with regard to emerging trends. How do we address this?
Well, I think conversations obviously are the way to go. Once again, I think as everyone's talked about here, very often NGOs have chosen their boards because they're big guys, they are well known, they will bring a certain level of respectability to the organization, etc., visibility, respectability, etc. When you have someone like that and you've gone in on that basis, then you're simply happy for him to be there. And he is delivering. by simply being there. Please let us understand that that is what we have asked him for. At some point, if you don't need the visibility any longer because you become visible enough yourself, then it's time for him to say, well, this is not what we need anymore. And it's a difficult conversation, I think. Amit talked about it. It is a difficult conversation, but these are conversations that need to be had simply so that the organization can keep renewing itself. I would suggest that these are conversations that ought to be had in a context. So if you run an organization for 10 or 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 or 50 years on a particular basis, and tomorrow, because you've been here or you've been thinking about this question and so on, tomorrow you say to that, you're not doing your job, it's going to be difficult. It's going to be hard for that person because he doesn't understand why you suddenly turned. So I would recommend a context setting within the entire board meeting. Begin a conversation about what is this board supposed to be doing here? What is its role? How do we map its contributions? How do we map it to the skills that are required? How do we map it to the capacity building requirements that we have? Once you begin that process of dialogue should lead people to recognize whether they are or are not making any contribution. It should lead them to recognize whether they are or are not capable of making a contribution. And as long as it happens within a relatively impersonal way, so you're talking about the board as a whole rather than a particular person, you move in a direction, and over a period of time, the hope is that those conversations can become easier. Eventually, you might still have a difficult conversation, but at least I think we lay the foundation for a more sensible dialogue within which people are not feeling personally threatened, but are in fact looking at the needs of the organization and their own role within that.
Yeah, please.
If I could just add to that, I agree completely with Chittaranjan. I think, sometimes you need, because these are sensitive conversations, you need a crutch to, lean on. And I think the best crutch can be process. And so if you adopt few simple things like do an annual survey, get a donor to tell you that, one of the major things we need as a part of making the donation is that you have to do an annual board effectiveness survey. Have that survey as a very nice, comprehensive, we do this in Akanksha. We do effectiveness, board effectiveness survey. It's blind, it's done on the net. We use a software for doing it. And then, Anuaga is tasked with giving each board member feedback. But it becomes very easy. You get, and people vote. I mean, we've had people being voted as below average and people being voted above average. It will sit and deal with it. But I think if you put that into your process and say that, donors expect us to now do this, I think that's a crutch which becomes very useful to put your weight on. I think the second is simple parameters like attendance. Just adopt a rule which says that, if you basically miss, 2 out of 4 meetings or 50% of meetings, very clearly, I think, you aren't able to perform your duty and, so it'll become a conversation and say that we have to print this in our annual report, and I'm sure nobody likes to be marked absent for 100% of the time, so I think that's another good crutch that you can, simply put, lean on. And third is, I think, forced rotation. In my mind, I think that's can be a very powerful tool where you say that everyone will have terms, not more than 10 years, and that will force automatically fresh blood to be inducted into boards. Corporates have done it, and company exactly says that. So I think the same needs to be done, in my view, on the NGO sector as well.
I think we have time for just one more question, and this one is for Pradeep. How do you deal with conflict of interest when the conflicting party is the most capable?
Yeah, we... yeah.
Oh, we have 10 minutes. Oh, okay. Okay, great.
Okay. So I have 10 minutes to think of an answer? Think of an answer, not give an answer. No.
If you have 10 minutes, it means you have a conflict.
Conflict, yeah. No, I was just seeing this happen, at least in the corporate world. Historically, The independent directors were shy of bringing out conflict that exists in the promoter family's interest or a multinational interest, transactions, commercial transactions, buying, selling, appointing distributors, appointing travel agents, the family connections and stuff like this. These were galore. And over time, and this I think Amit, you have noticed, it was not uncommon. And these were very, very things which nobody talked about very comfortably, and it was just one of those things ignored. At least in the corporate world, the regulation has come in where conflict of interest in terms of related party transaction, believe me, I sit on some boards and some audit committee chairperson, etc. We spent huge amount of time in trying to filter out where there's conflict. Now there, the competence, how competent the conflicting party doesn't matter then, because the law doesn't allow you to do. So there is a certain, at least in the corporate sector, there is the legislation, regulation, which helps you filter out conflict of interest, at least the visible conflict of interest, financial transactions, appointment of dealers, appointment of distributors, in any such case, even appointment of relatives. So there is a reasonable amount of this in thing. I'm sure in NGOs also these challenges will be there, in organizations where there is something being done. And there it's, since the whole thing is supposed to be for the good of the society, how does it matter who's doing good for the society? Everybody is working toward good society. We tend to sort of put it across as a, not such a big deal. But if you have to live without conflict within yourself, you have to deal with the very strong conflict-oriented person with strength. So moment you succumb once, then I think you can never even talk about conflict of interest or even trivialities after that, because you know that thing. So my view would be, historically, a whole lot of us in governance had accepted few things. Farak nahi padta, you know, it's okay, you know, it's a small part. Let's look at the bigger picture. Now today, at least in corporate world, the filter and the sieve has become much tighter. There is a thing. And I think as a part of self-discipline in the social organization, it's a good idea to minimize. After all, why do you have to prepare yourself to defend something? Best thing is not to have those issues. So if it's a strong one, handle it strongly.
Okay, as I believe we do have time for one more question, I will take it. And yeah, please.
Actually, it's linked. One is that regarding. One is regarding conflict of interest, and here Noshir is very clear, and he'll direct us to this point that there is section 13.2 which makes it very clear if it's conflict of interest, turn the person out. Ask the person to resign because your registrations get lost. So it's very clear, and it's not just in corporate but gladly in NGOs also. The other thing I want to ask you is, from this panel I've learned a lot, but I want this question to be answered, that where do we find highly engaged, highly eminent members on our board? Don't all of them who are very engaged and very eminent gyrate and move towards eminent NGOs? What do small NGOs do or growing NGOs do? This is to all.
I think I'll hand it over to my fellow panelists as well. I'll just give you my perspective, and this is, I think you have to, you have to find people who don't necessarily have the same profile as what you typically would see for a large-scale organization in the same space, if you're someone who's relatively smaller. And often I think that's the mistake that people end up making, and they are always constantly trying to find people of exactly that same profile. And that's the point I was making earlier, that think about making an investment in that person as well, because the fact is skills exist, right? If you're talking of a lawyer, everyone wants to have Zia Modi or Behram Vakil or Cyril Shroff or anyone on their board, but the fact is there are lots of very competent lawyers in the country. have you gone and tried to actually develop a relationship with them? They may not be at one of the top 5, 7 firms. Their names may not appear in newspapers and magazines, but they're still very competent lawyers. The same is the case with accountants, and same is the case with any skills that you're looking for. So I think it requires effort, and my limited point was that you have to basically go out and make that investment in people and start, I'll tell you, when Shaheen got me involved with Akanksha, I wasn't even running, DSP Merrill Lynch at that point of time. I was 2 levels below that. And, she wasn't going around trying to get Hemendra Kothari on the board. She basically made an investment in getting me on the board. And so I think the same way, if today you're a relatively smaller organization and you're trying to construct a board, you need to find that person 2 levels down in an organization who actually wants to contribute with her or his time and, and expertise.
If I could add, engaged is more important. Tell me, friends, when if I ask you, where did you like the food most? You may or may not say 5-star hotel. Some dhabas, some dosa shop you will say is good. So we don't have to go by labels. Necessarily.
I asked the question, it's double-edged. Eminent and engaged. Okay, they are not eminent and engaged.
So I think Amit has answered, get an engaged person and get a chota Amit. You know who becomes the thing. You know exactly which is what we did. No, I'm saying...
Even my wife wants a chota Amit.
So the issue is, don't go for labels in the beginning. Go for people who are willing to give their time, energy. And I think Amit mentioned this point earlier. And that's what. Leave the fancy ones where they are. They'll take care of themselves.
And I would simply say this, that at any given point in time, there is only this question to be asked: who will take me to the next level? It is impossible for me to go 25 levels up. It will not happen because I have my own growth path. I have my own ability, my learning curve, etc., etc. So I don't need the best star out there. In fact, he might not be very useful for the kind of growth that I need in my organization, for the kind of development of capacities that I need here. I need someone who will hold my hand and sort of take me to the next level. That's all I need. And therefore, there'll be lots of those people around. For each of us, there is someone who will hold our hand and help us move. We don't need eminent people. We need people who will help us grow. That's it.
So Tina's just flashed the 5-minute sign, so I think I'll use my prerogative as anchor of this panelist and answer the last question, and then we can conclude. So Vasumati asked, what are the most important skills we should look for in board members? I think we've touched upon this, but I will just give an example actually from a board, international board that Naushad was on and then I was on. I think international boards pay a lot more cognizance to this, and we had to they actually had not a board evaluation, but a third party had done a sort of a competency mapping of the board in terms of age, diversity, meaning gender, etc., and then skills. And I think skills are really what you need on your board. So for example, in certain boards, you may be pretty heavy on finance people, so you may not see that as a gap on your board, is my view. Whereas in other organizations, for example in CAP, I think we need people who would do better PR communication and stuff for us. I also think we need people who would bring in more money into CAP and understand what CAP is doing, and therefore be more engaged to bring in more financial resources. So I think it varies from board to board, but I do think that this template that we used on this international board was really good because it was done by a third party, as well as individual board members also had to do an assessment as per their view. And we were a board that was really international. Some of us were from Asia, Africa, and all over the world. So it was a great learning for me, and in fact I kept that template because I do think it has helped me to look at other boards that I'm on and understand where are really the gaps and where do we need to fill those. So I think we are on time, and I'm try always to be a punctual person. I just want to say a huge thank you again to all my panelists for being with us today. I hope it was a learning for you all as much as it was for me. I'd just like to conclude by saying two things. One is that, Mayor took a lot of trouble to think about different structures for each panel. And for the governance panel, I was the person who said, I think governance is black or white. There's really no shades of gray, but it would be great to have opinions of people from both social and corporate sector. And from the corporate sector, although we can learn a lot, and similarly from the social. And that's why we were really delighted that all these three gentlemen agreed to be a part of our panel, because I think they really brought a great mix. And I hope the learning was as valuable and as worthwhile as we hope it has been for you. So thank you very much for being an engaged audience, and thanks to all of you.